Hey everybody. Like you just said, my name's Dustin, and I kind of want you to put all that stuff you just said about me out of your mind. I want you to think of me right now as just like a regular Python user. I'm not a Python core contributor or anything like that. So this talk is really, from my perspective, just as a regular user, just like you guys. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about PEP 572. But first, in order to talk about that, I need to talk about Python governance. Python governance is the answer to the question, how do we make decisions for the Python language? Like, how do we decide new syntax and things like that? When Python was first created, its creator installed himself as the BDFL, the Benevolent Dictator for Life. Dictator meaning that he can do whatever he wants, and benevolent meaning that generally he's going to look out for us as Python users. This is the creator of Python, Guido van Rossum. But one thing to note is that Python was created 20 years ago. In that time, it's really grown. A lot of things have changed. And Guido is not making all these decisions himself. The way that decisions are made in Python language is with a PEP, a Python enhancement proposal. This is kind of like amendments to the constitution for a country, which similarly determines how a country is governed. Each PEP builds on the next one, or the previous one, and makes changes to sort of like the law of Python, right? So we started with PEP 1, and we grew from there. So can anyone name a PEP? PEP, yeah, right, okay. PEP 8. Yeah, I figured you guys would say that. So PEP 8 is probably the most well-known PEP. It's a style guide for Python code. The author of this PEP is Guido van Rossum, as you might expect. Some other kind of interesting and well-known PEPs. There's PEP 20. This is the Zen of Python. It's what you get if you type import this in your Python REPL. The author of the Zen of Python was Tim Peters, who's one of Python's core contributors. My favorite PEP is PEP 566, metadata for Python packages 2.1. The reason I like this one is because I am the author of this PEP. Okay, so when I wrote this PEP, this was what the process was generally like. I came up with a draft for the PEP that fit some format for how PEPs should be made. Then it went for acceptance. Someone accepted it. And then it was implemented. So one thing to note is that Guido himself did not approve my PEP directly. In fact, I'm quite sure that he has never read it, and he has no idea who I am. Instead, what we do is we have BDFL delegates. And these are people that Guido has entrusted the ability to make decisions about Python in areas which either he doesn't really care about, doesn't know that much about, or thinks someone else is a better steward for that part of Python. So the flow of power kind of looks like this. There's Guido, and then there's the delegates beneath him, and they derive their power from Guido, and then all those delegates are approving PEPs, and sometimes Guido is approving PEPs as well. So you might have heard about PEP 572. The title of this PEP was Assignment Expressions. And the reason you might have heard about it is because it caused a little bit of drama. The whole point of this PEP is these two little characters. And it has a name. It's a new operator for Python. I'm not going to tell you what the name of it is, though. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it the Walrus operator, because it kind of looks like a walrus lying on its side. And by the way, I gave this talk once before, and people were really concerned that this walrus was dead. He's not dead. He is just resting. Don't worry. All right, so instead of explaining to you word for word the body of this PEP and what it aims to do, I'm going to give you some examples to give you some ideas about why we need the Walrus operator. One is for balancing lines of code and complexity, LOC and big O. So let's take this example. Let's say I'm setting the variable foo to f of x to the power of 2, f of x to the power of 3. Let's say f of x is a really expensive computation, and we don't want to rerun it every single time. Right here, we're calling it 3 times, but it's going to give us the same result every time. So what you would normally do as a Python user is you would break that out into a new line. You'd set a new variable to the value of f of x, and then you'd reuse that variable y inside your comprehension. Some people don't like this because it's 2 lines of code where you could have 1 line of code and a little more complexity. If you had the Walrus operator, you could do this. You could set y equals f of x inside the expression, and the value of that gets evaluated to y, and then you can reuse y throughout that condition, or that comprehension. So you're able to reuse a value that's expensive to compute. Another example for why you might want to use this is avoiding inefficient comprehensions. So let's look at this quick little for loop, right? We have empty results. We're iterating over data. We're calling f of x on each piece of the data. If it's not none, we're adding it to the results. So normally, when I see a for loop that looks like this, that has an empty list sitting above it like that, this is a smell to me, and I say this should probably be a list comprehension. And you'd be right. If you turn this into a list comprehension, it would look like this, it would look a little bit cleaner, and it would also be more inefficient because you'd be calling f of x twice now instead of calling it once. And again, you're doing unnecessary work here. With the Walrus operator, you can do something very similar to what we did before. You can set y equals f of x in the conditional down below, in the filter clause, sorry, and then you can reuse it, share that sub-expression in the other part of the comprehension. Another example, unnecessary variables in scope. So if you've ever used the regular expression module in Python, you've probably written something kind of like this. You call pattern.search for some piece of data, and then you get back something that is either none, or it's a regular expression match object, and then you can do things with it. So you always have this sort of check in your code. If match is not none, do something match. What happens here is match is always going to exist farther down. As you continue past this if conditional, match is still going to be there. And it's kind of like a little bit annoying, right? Like you only need match inside of that expression, but it's sitting outside of it. So with the Walrus operator, you can do this. Match : equals pattern search data. It's all within the conditional, and you can only use it within the conditional there as well. One more example. This is a pretty common use case if you're processing a file or a stream or something in chunks, right? Let's say you initialize a chunk variable with file.read. You read 8192 bytes from a file or whatever. And then while that chunk still exists, you continue to read from it. You process it, and then you read. You process, then you read. You just keep going until it's empty. So this could be simplified with the Walrus operator. You could just do something like this. While chunk : equals file.read, process chunk. And this just keeps going and going and going until chunk is none, and then the while loop exits. OK. You might be saying, like, why? The Python code we had before was pretty good, and it still worked. And if I paid attention to where I was using expensive computations, I could avoid them entirely. That's fine. One argument for why is maybe fewer lines are better, right? I don't know if you guys know, but programmers kind of hate change. And so minimizing your diffs by at least one line is generally worth it, right? You want to minimize the amount of code that your peers, your open source maintainers have to read. And just minimizing by one line is generally worth it. So if I can turn this into this, my coworkers are going to love me, right? Maybe. Maybe actually fewer lines are going to be more efficient, right? So another example with that read.match, one of the proponents of this PEP went and found an example where instead of writing these two lines together, the programmer had combined them into a single line like this. But again, it's inefficient. They're calling read.match data twice in this expression, where they really should only need to do it once and store it in a variable. The Walrus operator, they could have done this, and it would have been more efficient. So ultimately, it becomes a trade-off between developer complexity and computer efficiency. There's some other fun tricks we can do with the Walrus operator as well. One is a witness. So let's say we have a file of source code, and we want to find the first comment in that file. So we can iterate over each line in that file. If the file starts with the hash symbol, we set it to be the comment, and we break out of the for loop. And at the end, we have a conditional. It checks to see if the comment exists. If not, we print there are no comments. With the Walrus operator, we can simplify this and use the any keyword operator to iterate over all the lines and break as soon as the first comment line is found, and then reuse that variable inside the if statement. Counterexample would be the same thing, but other way around. If we want to find the first non-blank line, we could do the same thing, and we can use all to iterate over everything until the very end, and then see if any of the lines ended up being non-blank or not. All right, one last example. Let's say that we had a list of values, and we wanted to compute the running total. So we wanted to compute the total of 1, 1 plus 2, 1 plus 2 plus 3. We could do this with a for loop just like this, and partial sums would be 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, on and on. With the Walrus operator, this becomes a lot simpler. We can reuse total inside the comprehension and add to it as we go, and it gets assigned to each value for v and values, and partial sums ends up being the same thing. Okay. You might still be like, all right, those all seem really nice, but I don't really see why I need to use this. You might also say, this kind of actually looks like the equals expression, the equals operator. And it's important to note that the Walrus operator is actually nothing like the equals operator. Everywhere that you can use the equals operator, you cannot use the Walrus operator. So if you wanted to do x equals y equals z, you could do that. If you wanted to do z walrus y walrus x equals 0, you cannot do that. You can't do these multiple targets like this. If you wanted to set the value of a dictionary to x, you could do that with the equals operator. You cannot do that with the Walrus operator. Same thing for properties. You can set a property with the equals operator. You cannot do it with the Walrus operator. And one other kind of weird thing, right here, x equals 1, 2 would give us a tuple of 1 and 2 for x. But instead, on the second line, if we use the Walrus operator, we get x is equal to 1. The comma takes priority here. And lastly, we can't do things like plus walrus equals tax. It doesn't make any sense. And actually, I don't know what we would call it. Maybe like walrus with like a Pope hat on top. Okay, so that is PEP 572. And I'm seeing a little bit of blank stares in the audience, right? Some people either don't get it right away, which is fine, or some people think, this is weird, and I don't like it, even though maybe I understand it, and that's fine too. And generally, this was kind of the reception, right? Like I said before, people hate change, and programmers especially hate change. So one argument that people had about this was backwards incompatibility. Where is this going to work? The thing is, it's not backwards compatible. If you write code using the Walrus operator, you cannot use it in older versions of Python that didn't support that syntax. So it's not a breaking change to the syntax, but it's not backwards compatible. Another is teachability. The reason I didn't tell you this before, what the name of it was, is because it's kind of confusing what the name of it is. We can't call it the Walrus, that's my little name for it. But you could call it the assignment operator maybe, but no, that's actually the equals symbol. You could call it the becomes operator. You could call it a named expression. And so the named expression is actually the actual name for it, but it doesn't really explain exactly what it is. What is a named expression? Another common complaint about this is the attractiveness of it. It's just ugly, right? Especially if you're used to looking at Python code that looks a certain way. Python code that looks a little bit different is probably going to look a little ugly to you. So the response to this was really huge, right? There was a lot of discussion, mostly on the Python committers core mailing list, like a lot of discussion, a lot of threads on the mailing list. There were polls that were made of the core contributors, figuring out if people liked it or disliked it. Turns out a lot of them didn't like it. And then there were people sort of just making statements about the result of it. So Tim Peters, I talked about him before. He's the author of the Zen of Python. He said the current proposal for PEP 572 would have allowed a modest but clear improvement in quite a few bits of code. Barry Warsaw, he's another core contributor. He said, since it changes the syntax of the language, people tend to focus on that without understanding the deeper semantic issues. Lukasz Langa, another core contributor, said, dictators should dictate. He thought that Guido should just ignore all the discussion and do whatever he wanted. And Guido himself said that he had to stop reading the thread so he wouldn't go insane. So eventually, after all this discussion, Guido accepted the PEP, and then he sent a notice to the mailing list saying that he was transferring his power as BDFL, that he was going to go on a permanent vacation, that he didn't want to have to fight so hard for a PEP and find that so many people despise his decisions. I like to show tweets of people talking about things when I do presentations like this. So there's a couple tweets that happened sort of right after Guido announced this. This one's kind of interesting. This guy, many months before this happened, he had wished that file chunking thing that I had shown before, he wished that was part of Python. And then his birthday wish came true, but at what cost? Guido's left the language. This person, he whispers that PEP 572 rocks. What a farewell gift from Guido. This person says that feel when Reddit says PEP 572 lost the Zen of Python, but the author of the Zen is a co-author of the PEP. This person says, I am shocked by the vitriol that we throw at people who run important free and open software projects. And this person said, PEP 572 is a trash feature, and I'm sad that it was straw that broke Guido's back. I want to be very clear here. We're talking about straws. The straw that broke Guido's back was not trash PEPs given to him by PEP authors. It was having your work called trash by people on the internet, right? Here's the thing that I think we kind of have forgotten, and I say we as in people in the Python community. I'm not saying that any of you made these comments. I'm not saying that I made this comment. But we as the Python community, we're forgetting that like dictators are people too. It's true. Like Guido is the creator of our language, but he's a person, and he has feelings and everything that goes along with that. And this is not limited to people as super famous as Guido as well. Literally, this morning in my hotel room, I was checking Twitter, and I saw this. This person, Glyph, you might be familiar with him, he announced a new project called Publication. And the response to it, literally the first tweet in response to it is, I think I said this before, but I think this is a terrible library, a terrible mindset. Did you forget on and on and on? It's not just limited to the dictators, it's limited to just the regular open source maintainers as well. Maintainers are people too. And really, people are people too. I think this is what we're forgetting here, is that like everyone that you talk to on the internet is a real person. So I think as a community, we need to step back a little bit and think like, how are we interacting with each other? That we were so mean and vitriolic that the creator of our language stepped away from us. All right, so I'm going to preempt some questions about this. The first is, what does this mean for Python? So I gave this talk before, and someone in the audience said, is this going to be the PEP that ends all PEPs? And in a way, it's kind of true, actually. So with Guido, like I said, the power to approve PEPs come from him. So if he's left the language, the delegates don't have any power to approve PEPs either. And so right now, actually, we can't currently approve any PEPs. We can't actually make any changes to Python, anything about it. But I want you to know that it's going to be okay. There are a lot of smart people, a lot of core contributors that are working on the governance problem. And Guido, when he left specifically, entrusted those people with figuring out what they were going to do next. So if you want to read more about this, you can go look at PEP 8000, not PEP 8, PEP 8000, which is the Python language governance proposal overview. This will tell you how the core contributors are going to choose a new way to govern the language, how they're going to vote on it, when they're going to vote on it, and all the proposals for the way that this is going to work going forward. If you want to look at each of the ways which the proposals that have been made, you can go back in time and watch Brett's talk here on the stage 3 hours ago, where he gave a really great overview, and Brett is a core contributor as well. He gave a great overview of each of these proposals that are currently up for vote. And the vote itself is going to happen November 16th. This is not something that you all can participate in. The vote is limited to core contributors of the Python language. But it's going to be really important, and it's going to determine the path forward for our language. So another question. Will this really, truly actually become part of Python? Like, am I going to actually see a Walrus operator? Because remember when I said the process for the PEPs were draft, acceptance, implementation. This PEP is sitting at the acceptance stage of that right now. And the answer to this is almost definitely, but it won't be till Python 3.8. So the Python Core Developer Summit, I think, just happened, and part of that, they worked on implementing this PEP. So because it was accepted by Guido, it means that it's law right now, and it's going to become part of Python. Probably not till 3.8. You might say, wow, I don't like it. And that's okay. Like, you are entitled to your opinion, and you don't have to like everything. If you don't like it, then don't write it. Like, no one is going to force you to use the Walrus operator. And if someone in your team is telling you that you should use it, then it's your job to convince them not to, or for them to convince you that you should. Another question that I'll preempt. Is Guido going to come back? And the answer to this depends on what you mean. Like, is Guido going to come back to Python? Yes, he's still going to be contributing to the language. He's still going to be helping us out and working in Python. He's not going to switch to another language or anything like that. But in terms of, is he going to maybe someday, hopefully, he'll just come back as BDFL and solve this for us? I'd say probably not. Python is 28 years old now, and Guido is kind of like its parent. So at this point, like, Python has grown up, and it's time for it to, go out into the world and make it on its own. Another question is this going to happen again? And again, I think this kind of depends on what you mean. Maybe you mean, will another PEP be this controversial? And I would say probably not. To me, this PEP felt like kind of an outlier. It was a relatively small change to the language that people could look at immediately and have a really gut reaction to. But maybe you actually mean, like, will people be negative on the internet again? And like, I don't know. I hope not. I hope this makes people sort of step back a minute and say, maybe we should be a little bit nicer. But I mean, the thing is, so many people use Python now, such a wide range of people. And for most of those people, the language already kind of feels perfect. Like, why change something that's already perfect? So I guess it is possible that this is the new status quo, right? Like, anytime we try to make a fundamental change to the language, that this is going to keep happening. But I really hope it's not. I really hope that we can entrust the people that know the most about our language to make good decisions for us, and that we aren't so reactionary to them on Twitter and just treat those dictators, those maintainers, those people like they're actually people. Thanks, everyone. So I have a little time for questions if folks have.
Yeah, we do have time for questions. So I have the mic. Any questions for Dustin? Yes, there's one. You have to hold the mic.
Hi, Christine Blair. I'm just wondering if there's been any discussion among the core contributors about accessing resources for mediation and conflict resolution, because it's such an important part of an important community, and there's lots of stuff out there. So I just encourage that to open that conversation.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think I can't speak for any of the core contributors. Like I said, I am not one. So I know some of them have suffered burnout before, and I think that's also something that I've experienced in open source and other people have experienced. And yeah, I would encourage all those people to get help as well. Any other questions? All right, thanks everyone. I'll be available afterwards as well.
Thank you, Dustin.